Have you ever imagined being on an ordinary day, just trying to survive, and suddenly one of the biggest icons in world music stops right in front of you? What if I told you that Michael Jackson did something so unbelievable that it left a girl speechless and completely changed her life? This story was hidden for years, but today you will discover what really happened that day. It was a day like any other. The sun was shining brightly, reflecting off the hot asphalt of a busy street. People were walking quickly, cars were passing. By quickly, and in the middle of all this rush, a girl was holding a small box, drawing the attention of pedestrians. His voice was soft, but determined. She sold sandwiches, trying to earn a few bucks to help her family. His gaze carried the innocence of a child, but also the weight of someone who already knew the difficulties of life. And then, without warning, the unexpected happens. A black limousine with tinted windows approaches slowly. The people around start to look curious. Who could be in there? A politician, a rich businessman, but no one was prepared for what came next. The seconds seemed to drag by as the limousine's windows slowly lowered, and it was at that moment that the girl felt her heart race. His breathing became ragged. She blinked a few times, not believing what she was seeing. There, sitting in the back seat with a kind look and a discreet smile on his lips, he was Michael Jackson, the king of pop, the one that filled stadiums, drew crowds, and moved entire generations. Was now there, in front of her. The girl froze. She didn't know what to do, what to say. I could only stare in disbelief, and then Michael did something no one expected, and that's where this story becomes even more unbelievable. Now tell me, can you imagine what happened next? Stay with me until the end, because this story will move. The girl was called Emily. He was only 11 years old, but he already knew the meaning of the word fight. Every day, early in the morning, he left with his small styrofoam box filled with sandwiches that his mother prepared the night before. They didn't have much, but it was enough to secure some coins and put food on the table. Her father had been gone years ago, and since then she and her mother faced each day as a new battle. The street where Emily worked was noisy and full of life. Cars honked non-stop. Street vendors called customers on every corner, and pedestrians walked hurriedly, many not even paying attention to her. Tall buildings cast shadows on the sidewalk, and the smell of food mixed with exhaust fumes created a heavy air, typical of big cities. She always positioned herself in the same place, close to a traffic light, where cars stopped for a few seconds. She took every opportunity to approach and offer her sandwiches, often being ignored, but always insisting, because she knew that if she could sell enough, her mother could get some rest that night. The day was already half over, and Emily felt tiredness weighing on her shoulders. The hot sun left his skin slightly red, and sweat dripped down his forehead. Still, she smiled at each person who passed by, hoping that someone would buy another sandwich. It was then that something caught his attention. An imposing black limousine glided down the street and stopped a few meters from her. The car seemed out of place there, a symbol of luxury amid the hustle and bustle of everyday life. The tinted windows prevented anyone from seeing who was inside, and Emily felt a shiver run down her spine. The seconds passed slowly. Some people around also noticed the car and started whispering, trying to guess who could be inside. Celebrities rarely passed through that side of town. Would he be a politician, a businessman, or just someone very rich who didn't want to be bothered? Emily held tight to her styrofoam box and took a deep breath. Maybe this was his chance. She hesitated for a moment, but decided to step forward. With a firm but delicate voice, he lifted one of the sandwiches and said, "Sir, madam, do you want to buy a snack?" She didn't expect an answer. Most rich people wouldn't even look at her, But then, to his surprise, the car window began to slowly roll down. The world seemed to slow down in that instant, and when the face finally appeared, Emily felt her heart stop. There, looking directly at her, with a gentle gaze and a discreet smile, was Michael Jackson, the king of pop. The one she only knew from television, who her mother always said was one of the greatest artists of all time. She froze. The words simply disappeared from his mouth. And then, Michael did something completely unexpected. Silence took over that moment. Emily remained still, unable to look away. Her heart was beating so fast she could hear her own chest pulsing. It was as if the noise of the cars, the horns and the voices around them had disappeared, leaving only her and that gentle look in front of her. Michael Jackson leaned out of the limousine window a little, watching the girl curiously. He wore sunglasses and a black hat, but even so, Emily could see the softness in his expression. His face looked calm, almost as if he was waiting for something. The girl's eyes blinked a few times, and she finally managed to catch her breath. He felt his sweaty hands tightening his grip on the styrofoam box. "I couldn't miss this opportunity." "Sandwiches, sir," she managed to say, her voice coming out weak, almost shaky. Michael lowered his sunglasses a little and smiled. Then, without saying anything, he made a subtle hand signal. The limousine door opened, and one of Michael's security guards, a tall, serious-looking man, got out of the car. He quickly looked around, as if checking his surroundings, and then walked over to Emily. She held her breath. "How many sandwiches do you have there?" The security guard's deep voice made her swallow hard. Emily looked inside the box. There were still some. Maybe 5, maybe 6. "6, sir." The security guard gave a brief nod and then turned to Michael, who remained watching the scene. And it was then that something even more unbelievable happened. Michael opened the door, and with the lightness of someone used to sliding across the stage, got out of the car. He stood in front of the girl, adjusting his hat with a quick movement of his hands. The few people around began to realize what was happening. Whispers and surprised looks spread around the place. Emily felt her legs go weak. What was happening? Why was Michael Jackson there, in front of her? He pointed to the sandwiches with a smile and said in his soft, unmistakable voice, "I want them all." The girl blinked, not believing what she had just heard. "Everyone." Michael nodded slowly, and before Emily could react, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a doubled amount of money. He didn't ask the price. He didn't do any calculations. He just held out the amount to the girl, and when she saw what was in his hands, her jaw dropped. It was much more than enough, much, much more, and in that moment Emily knew that this day would never be just an ordinary day again. Emily's eyes widened. She looked at the money, then at Michael, then at the money. Again, his brain seemed unable to process what was happening. That amount was absurd. Much more than the price of the sandwiches, much more than she and her mother could manage in an entire month. His hesitant fingers trembled as he held the ballots. His mind screamed that this couldn't be real. "Sir, that's a lot of money," she murmured, still in disbelief. Michael tilted his head slightly to the side with a gentle smile. His gaze seemed to shine with a mixture of tenderness and amusement. He bent down a little to be at the girl's height, and in his calm, soft voice said something that Emily would never forget. "Small gestures can change big stories." Those words echoed inside her. Michael took one of the sandwiches from the box and unwrapped it carefully, as if he were dealing with something special. He took a light bite, chewed slowly, and closed his eyes for a moment, as if he was enjoying every second of that moment. He murmured, smiling. "It's delicious." Emily felt a strange heat grow inside her chest. It wasn't just happiness. It was something deeper, a mix of relief, gratitude, and emotion. The buzz around started to increase. Some people had already recognized Michael Jackson and were approaching, curious, trying to understand what was happening. Some took out their cell phones to record, while others just watched, perplexed. Emily looked around, realizing that that moment no longer belonged to her alone. It was as if time had frozen, so that everyone could witness that scene. It was then that Michael did something even more unexpected. He took another sandwich from the box, unwrapped it, and turned to his security guard. "You need to try this." The security guard, who maintained a rigid posture, blinked a few times, clearly surprised. He didn't expect Michael to offer him a snack there in the middle of the street, but hesitantly he picked up the sandwich and took a bite. For a moment, everyone was silent, and then, to everyone's surprise, the security guard smiled. Michael laughed, pleased. "Did you see that? I said it was good." Emily couldn't hold back her laughter. That scene was surreal. The biggest star in the world was there, standing in front of him, eating one of the sandwiches his mother had prepared the night before, and suddenly, as if all of this were the most natural thing in the world, Michael took another sandwich and turned to a man who was passing by on the sidewalk. "Do you want one too?" The man, clearly surprised, accepted without thinking twice. And then, as if it were a big impromptu picnic, Michael started handing out the sandwiches to whoever was nearby. Emily watched everything with teary eyes. She had left the house that morning, just wanting to sell enough to pay for dinner. Now I was living in a moment I could never have imagined, and what happened next was even more unbelievable. What happened next was something Emily could never have imagined, something that would be etched in the memory of everyone there. Michael Jackson, one of the most famous men on the planet, was standing on the sidewalk distributing the sandwiches she sold, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. But for Emily it wasn't. None of it seemed real. She blinked several times, trying to convince herself that she wasn't dreaming. The small group around them grew larger by the second. Some people passing by stopped when they realized what was happening. Others simply looked, hesitant, not believing it was really him. The limousine parked next to the curb, the alert security guards, the way Michael smiled calmly. All of that created an almost cinematic scene. Emily held the empty box, her heart still racing. Michael had bought all the sandwiches, but he didn't keep them to himself. He handed them over one by one to strangers passing by. A young man in a suit who looked like he was late for a meeting accepted one and laughed nervously when he realized who was offering it to him. A white-haired lady carrying heavy bags picked up another one and touched Michael's hand tenderly, as if wanting to make sure he was real. And then the unexpected happened. A little girl, not much younger than Emily, held her mother's hand and looked at everything, her eyes shining with admiration. She looked scared but also fascinated. "Michael noticed your expression and bent down to your level." "Do you want one too?" he asked with a gentle smile. The girl hesitated, looked at her mother, who nodded with a nervous smile. Then, with his small hands, he took the sandwich that Michael handed him. She held the snack for a moment, as if it were a treasure, and then looked straight into his eyes. "Are you really real?" he asked, his innocent voice full of admiration. Michael let out a low laugh, full of sweetness. He raised his hand to his chest, made a playful gesture, and winked at her. "I think so." The little girl smiled hugely and ran to hug him. For a brief moment, everyone around held their breath. The security guards watched attentively, but Michael simply returned the hug. He put his arm around the girl and closed his eyes, as if that moment was precious to him too. Emily watched it all without words. The money was still in his hand. It was more than she and her mother had seen in months, but somehow the amount no longer seemed the most important thing. What really mattered was what she was seeing. Michael Jackson, a man who could be anywhere in the world, surrounded by luxury and fame, chose to stop there, on that simple sidewalk, to share a moment with ordinary people. And Emily felt something inside her shift, but this story was still far from over. What happened next was even more unbelievable. Time seemed to have stopped. The people around were still in shock, some not knowing how to react. Others murmured among themselves, pointed, tried to understand how it was possible that Michael Jackson was there in the middle of the street interacting with strangers as if it were any other day. But for Emily, this wasn't just any day. She was still holding the money. Her hands were shaking slightly. The weight of that amount was enormous, not just for the value itself, but for what it meant. It was enough to help her mother pay bills, buy food, maybe even allow Emily to take a break from the exhausting routine of selling sandwiches on the streets. But at that moment, all his attention was focused on the scene happening before his eyes. Michael remained bent down, still talking to the little girl who had hugged him moments before. He seemed completely at ease, as if he weren't surrounded by a growing number of people who, little by little, were starting to get closer. It was then that a middle-aged man, wearing simple clothes and holding an empty shopping cart, took a hesitant step forward. His face was marked by time. His eyes carried the tiredness of someone who had already lived through many battles. He looked at Michael, then at Emily, then at the few sandwiches left in the box. Michael noticed the man and smiled. "Are you hungry?" he asked with the same softness in his voice. The man hesitated for a second, perhaps embarrassed, but then nodded slightly. Michael took one of the last sandwiches from Emily's box and handed it to the man. But unlike the others, who accepted quickly, it took him a little longer. He looked at the snack as if it were something precious, as if it had been a while since the last time someone had offered him something without expecting anything in return. He took the sandwich with shaking hands, looked at Michael with teary eyes, and with a choked voice said softly, "Thank you. May God bless you." Michael just smiled again, saying nothing. But his eyes said it all, and it was there in that moment that something inside Emily changed forever. She had spent so much time trying to sell those sandwiches to get money, to provide for her family, that she had never stopped to see the impact that something so simple could have. At that moment, she realized that those sandwiches weren't just food. They were gestures of kindness. They were human warmth. They were a connection between people who might otherwise never notice each other. And then, while Michael was still, looking at the man tenderly, Emily made a decision. With his heart racing, he took the last sandwich left in the box and looked around. There were so many people there, so many different expressions, so many stories she would never know. But one of them caught his attention. A young woman with a child on her lap watched everything from afar. His gaze carried curiosity, but also something more, something Emily recognized well, need. She took a deep breath, feeling her own chest fill with something new. A feeling that she couldn't name, but that pulsed strongly inside her. Holding tight to the last sandwich, he stepped forward and extended his hand to the woman. Her eyes widened in surprise. "For you," Emily said, with a shy smile. The woman blinked a few times, almost as if in disbelief. Then, slowly, he accepted the snack, holding it carefully, as if it were something fragile and valuable. "Thank you," she murmured, and her voice carried genuine emotion. Emily felt a wave of heat spread through her chest. It was a feeling unlike any other. It was joy, but also gratitude, and when she looked at Michael again, she saw him watching her. He didn't say anything, just smiled, and in that smile, Emily knew he had seen what she had done. But this story is not over yet. What happened next was even more surprising. Time seemed to float around Emily. The heat of the asphalt no longer bothered her as much. The noise of the cars seemed distant, and the only thing that made her heart beat so hard was Michael Jackson's gaze fixed on her. That smile, full of tenderness and complicity, was as if he knew exactly what was going on inside her. Emily looked down, feeling heat rise to her face. I didn't know how to explain what I felt. Never in his entire life had he experienced anything like it. It wasn't just happiness. It was something bigger. It was as if for a moment she had seen the world in a different way. As if I had understood something that had always been there, but that I had never really realized. Michael took a step forward, bent down a little, and looked directly at her. "You have a good heart," he said softly. Those words hit Emily like lightning. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. He could only nod slightly, still trying to understand everything that was happening. Suddenly, a new movement around caught his attention. The group of people who had just been watching before began to get even closer. Now they were no longer just curious. Many seemed touched by the scene they had witnessed. A lady, who was wearing a flowery headscarf, touched Emily's shoulder and smiled sweetly. "What a beautiful girl. Your mother must be very proud of you." Emily blinked in surprise. Your mother. She hadn't thought about her since this all started. His heart skipped a beat as he imagined her reaction when she found out what had happened. She looked again at the money still in her hand. That amount would change their lives, but somehow Emily felt like there was something even more valuable than those bills right now. Michael then turned to the security guards and said something in a low voice. One of them nodded, took out a small pad of paper and handed it to Michael, along with a pen. Michael looked at Emily again, then at his empty styrofoam box. "Do you have any more sandwiches at home?" Emily widened her eyes, not knowing exactly what he was getting at. "Yes, my mother makes more every night." Michael smiled, signing the paper in his elegant handwriting and then handing it to her. "Then I want more tomorrow. Can you bring me?" Emily took the paper with shaking hands. It was a check signed by Michael Jackson. She didn't understand much about money, but she knew that that piece of paper was worth much more than anything she had ever held in her life. She looked at Michael, stunned. But I don't know where to find you." Michael chuckled softly, bending down a little more to be at her level. "I always find someone who has a good heart." Emily didn't know what to say. He just held the check against his chest, feeling the tears burning in his eyes, and then, as if that moment had been just a dream, Michael took a step back, adjusted his hat, and made a small gesture with his head. One of the security guards opened the limousine door, and he entered smoothly without rushing, as if he knew that this farewell needed to be felt. The people around were still in shock. Some tried to take photos, others simply looked in silence, as if they were trying to remember that moment forever. Emily was still there, standing on the sidewalk, the check still pressed against her chest, as she watched the limousine begin to move. And when she thought that moment was ending, something unexpected happened. Michael, already sitting inside the car, rolled down the window once again. He looked directly at Emily, and with a soft smile, raised his hand to his lips and blew an air kiss. It was the last thing she saw before. The limousine disappeared into the traffic, but that gesture, that small gesture, it would change your life forever. And what happened after that night was even more unbelievable. Emily remained standing on the sidewalk, holding the check to her chest, as if it were a piece of dream that could slip away at any moment. The afternoon heat still enveloped the city, but she no longer felt the weight of the scorching sun or the noise of the cars around her. His mind was spinning around what had just happened. The people who witnessed everything began to slowly disperse, but some still looked at her with admiration and surprise. A man passed by and lightly tapped him on the shoulder. "Little girl, you just experienced something that few people in the world could imagine." Emily tried to smile, but the emotion was still stuck in her throat. His legs were shaking, and only when he took the first step back home did he realize that his hands were sweaty from nervousness. She took a deep breath. He needed to tell his mother everything. The way home never seemed so long. The busy streets no longer had the same meaning for her. Every step she took was accompanied by the memory of Michael Jackson standing before her, smiling, speaking in his soft voice. Arriving at the simple house where she lived, Emily opened the door in a hurry. His mother was sitting at the table, sewing an old blouse to try to resell it the next day. As soon as he saw his daughter enter, he smiled softly. "How was today, dear? Did you manage to sell everything?" Emily stood still for a moment. Her hands were holding the check, but she still didn't know how to say it in words. "Mom, His voice trailed off. She looked at the paper in her hands and then at her mother, who was now frowning, realizing that something was different. "What happened, my love?" Emily took a deep breath and, without saying anything, held out the check. The mother took the paper without really understanding it. He looked at it for a moment, and then, when he read the name signed at the bottom, his face turned pale. What is this?" His voice came out as a whisper. Emily finally smiled, still feeling the weight of everything she had experienced. "Mom, I met Michael Jackson today." Silence took over the small room. The mother's eyes widened, holding the check as if it were made of glass. "What?" Emily nodded quickly. "He bought all the sandwiches, but he didn't stay with them. He gave it to people on the street, and he gave me this." The mother put a hand to her face, completely astonished. "But why?" Emily bit her lip, feeling her eyes water. "Because he said that small gestures can change big stories." Her mother stared at her for a few seconds. His eyes were full of tears, but also of a different shine. Then, suddenly, she let out an incredulous laugh and pulled Emily into a tight hug. "My God, my daughter, this is a miracle." Emily buried her face in her mother's shoulder, smelling the familiar scent of fabric and soap. Yes, it was a miracle. But somehow, she felt that this wasn't just luck. It was something bigger. And then, while still in her mother's arms, Emily had an idea that would change everything once again. And what happened next was even more unbelievable. The idea took hold of Emily's mind like a rapidly spreading fire. She pulled away from her mother's embrace and looked at the check once more. This wasn't just money, it was an opportunity. "Mom!" His voice came out determined, stronger than before. What if we used this money for something bigger?" The mother blinked, still trying to understand what was happening. "What do you mean, dear?" Emily took a deep breath. The heart was still beating fast, but now it was no longer from the shock. It was because of the excitement. Michael didn't buy the sandwiches because he was hungry. He bought it because he wanted to help. He saw that for some people a simple snack could mean a lot, and I also saw this today. I saw how people accepted those sandwiches, not just because they needed food, but because they needed a gesture of affection from someone who cared about them. The mother was silent, just listening, as Emily continued. "What if we used that money to make more sandwiches, but not to sell, to give to those in need?" The mother's eyes widened. "Emily, that's a beautiful gesture, but this money could help us so much." Emily held her mother's hands. "And it will help, Mother. It will help in an even greater way." Silence took over the small room for a few moments. The mother looked at her daughter, seeing something different about her. Emily was no longer just a girl who sold sandwiches to survive. Something inside her had changed, and then, with an emotional smile, the mother nodded. That same night they started working. There were hours of cutting bread, preparing fillings, carefully wrapping each sandwich. Emily and her mother laughed as they worked, something that hadn't happened in a long time. For the first time in a long time, Emily didn't just feel hope, she felt purpose. The next morning, Instead of going out to sell, Emily went out to distribute. She and her mother went to the streets where people needed it most. They gave sandwiches to elderly people who had nothing to eat, to tired workers who didn't have money for lunch, to mothers who struggled to feed their children, and every time they delivered one, Emily remembered Michael's words. Small gestures can change big stories. The impact was immediate. People started asking who was behind it, and the story started to spread. Small traders began to offer help, donating ingredients. Residents of the region began volunteering to distribute more snacks. What started with a simple gesture from Michael Jackson became a movement. Weeks later, something even more unbelievable happened. A letter arrived at Emily's house. The envelope was elegant, the paper of high quality. When she opened it and read the first words, she felt her hands shake. "Dear Emily, I heard what you did. You got the message. I'm so proud of you. Keep spreading the love." Michael. Tears streamed down Emily's face as she held the letter tightly. She never saw Michael in person again. But at that moment he realized he would never have to, because he had left a mark on her life that would never disappear. And what started as a simple, unexpected encounter on a random sidewalk changed his life forever. If this story touched your heart, you already know what to do. Leave your like right now, because it helps a lot to bring more incredible stories like this. And if you've made it this far, I want to hear from you in the comments. Small gestures can change big stories. Comment on this sentence so I know that you watched until the end, and that like Michael Jackson and Emily, you also believe in the power of kindness. And don't leave the channel yet. The next video is already appearing on the screen, and I'm sure you will be surprised by Michael Jackson's next unbelievable story. Click now and come with me.